Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Harlan County, Kentucky. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The name Hensley is all but forgotten in Harlan County today. Few locals will speak of them, and those who do lower their voices to just above a whisper. It's as if the very mention might summon something best left undisturbed from the hollows of those ancient Appalachian mountains. What transpired in the winter of 1892 remains one of the darkest chapters in Kentucky's history, a chapter that official records have done their best to obscure. According to county archives, the Hensley family arrived in Harlan sometime in the late 1870s, settling in a remote hollow some 12 miles northeast of the main settlement. The patriarch, Elijah Hensley, was noted in tax records as owning approximately 70 acres of mostly wooded hillside. Poor farming land by most accounts, but rich in coal deposits that would later prove valuable to mining interests. The deed of sale discovered in the county records office in 1952 indicates Elijah purchased the land with gold coins, an unusual form of payment that raised eyebrows even in those days. The document bears a strange notation in the margin. Buyer claims necessity of immediate occupation due to circumstances of grievous nature. The clerk who recorded this transaction, one Thomas McCreary, later became the county's first official historian, though his extensive journals make no further mention of the Hensley family, a curious omission given his meticulous documentation of other local families. The Hensley homestead was situated near what locals called Raven's Fork, a small tributary that fed into the Cumberland River. The area was known for its isolation, accessible only by a winding dirt path that became nearly impassable during the harsh Kentucky winters. This remoteness would later become a crucial factor in understanding the events that unfolded there. According to surveyors' maps from 1881, the property sat in a natural depression surrounded on three sides by steep ridges, creating what one report described as a natural amphitheater, where sounds echo strangely and the air hangs still even on windy days. County records show that Elijah, his wife Martha, and their 4 adult sons lived in a substantial timber frame house, unusually large for the area. A reporter from the Harlan Enterprise who visited the property in 1965 described it as a decaying monument to ambition gone awry, with rooms built upon rooms in seemingly haphazard fashion, as if the builder was attempting to create space for something that could never be contained. The original structure, according to building permits filed in 1878, was intended to be a modest 2-story dwelling. However, subsequent modifications expanded it considerably, with additions jutting out at odd angles, and what appeared to be a separate wing constructed entirely of local limestone. The family kept to themselves, rarely venturing into town except for occasional supplies. When they did appear, witnesses described them as unnervingly silent and moving as one unit. A shopkeeper's ledger from 1883 notes that the Hensleys purchased unusual quantities of salt, glass jars, and chemical compounds that the writer was unfamiliar with. The ledger contains a side note, asked E.H. about purpose. No clear answer given, will not inquire again. Martha Hensley was never seen in public after 1885, according to multiple accounts. When questioned about her absence, Elijah would simply state that she was attending to family matters. This explanation seemed to satisfy the non-intrusive mountain community, where privacy was respected almost as a religious tenet. What brought the Hensleys to Harlan remains unclear. Some accounts suggest they came from North Carolina, others Virginia. A church registry from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, contains entries for an Elijah and Martha Hensley through 1875, after which their names disappear from the record. Intriguingly, the church itself burned to the ground in 1876, destroying most of its archives. A local newspaper account of the fire mentions that it started in the records room and that certain documents were noted to be missing prior to the conflagration. The first indication that something was amiss in Harlan came in the spring of 1887, when a local hunter named Samuel Bowman reported unusual activities at the Hensley property. In a statement given to the county sheriff, Bowman claimed to have observed strange lights moving through the trees at all hours of the night and sounds unlike any animal native to these mountains. The sheriff's report notes that no action was taken, as no laws appeared to have been broken. However, a personal journal belonging to the deputy sheriff, discovered decades later, elaborates on Bowman's account. S.B. spoke of lights that moved against the wind and sounds like a woman weeping, but pitched wrong somehow. Claims to have seen figures moving in procession around the property, carrying what he took to be lanterns that cast no light on those who bore them. Bowman never returned to that hunting ground, and when asked years later about the incident, he refused to elaborate, saying only that some things are best left alone in these hills. The Hensley sons were known in the community only by their collective presence, rarely their individual identities. Tax records name them as Abel, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah, ranging in age from 27 to 35 in 1892. All four were described as tall, pale men with the same penetrating gaze as their father. A schoolteacher's diary from 1889 mentions an encounter with the eldest Hensley boy, who she described as possessed of a gaze so penetrating and devoid of common feeling that I found myself unable to maintain eye contact. She goes on to write that he inquired about books on the anatomy of grief and the physical manifestations of deep despair, requests she found disturbing enough to record. Local physician Dr. James Harrison noted in his medical logs that none of the Hensley family ever sought his services, despite the common ailments that affected most mountain families of the era. A single entry from 1886 mentions that Elijah Hensley purchased a substantial quantity of ether and surgical instruments, claiming they were for a research project of scientific significance. Dr. Harrison's notation concludes, "I find it curious that a man with no medical training would have need of such tools, but he paid in gold and asked no questions that would compromise my professional ethics." By 1890, rumors began to circulate among the mining communities that were beginning to establish themselves in the region. Workers reported hearing wailing sounds coming from the direction of the Hensley property on particularly still nights. A foreman's log from the Black Mountain Coal Company, dated June 15, 1890, notes, "Men refused to work the eastern face today after claiming to have heard a woman's screams echoing from the hollow. Lost day's production. Superstitious nonsense must be addressed." The same log 2 weeks later records, "Second incident of work stoppage due to alleged sounds. Have personally investigated and heard nothing unusual. However, noted strange atmospheric conditions in vicinity of Hensley property. Air seems thicker somehow, with an unusual metallic scent." A traveling minister who passed through the area in the autumn of 1890 wrote in his journal about being turned away from the Hensley home. "I approached the dwelling with the intention of offering spiritual comfort, as is my custom when visiting remote homesteads. Before I could announce my presence, the door opened, and a tall, gaunt man I took to be the patriarch addressed me by name, though we had never met. He informed me, in the most courteous terms, that my services were not required, as the family had transcended the limitations of conventional faith. As I turned to leave, I glimpsed through an open door what appeared to be a woman strapped to a chair, though the interior was too dim to be certain. I have prayed for that household every day since." The following winter was unusually harsh, with snow isolating many of the remote homesteads for weeks at a time. When spring finally broke, a peddler named William Franks became the first outsider to visit the Hensley property in months. What he witnessed there was never fully documented, as Franks appeared in town 3 days later in a state described by the local doctor as acute nervous collapse. The doctor's notes, preserved in the County Historical Society, state only that Franks babbled incoherently about walls that breathed and floors that wept, before being sent to the state asylum in Lexington, where he died 6 weeks later of what was termed failure of the heart due to extreme anxiety. An orderly at the asylum later claimed that Franks maintained a degree of lucidity in his final days, during which he dictated a letter to be delivered to the sheriff of Harlan County. This letter, if it ever existed, never reached its destination. However, the orderly, one Joseph Singleton, provided a sworn statement in 1912 claiming that Franks had described entering the Hensley home to find the interior transformed in ways that defied natural law. According to Singleton, Franks claimed that the dimensions inside the house did not match its exterior, with hallways that seemed to extend for impossible distances and rooms that changed their configuration when not directly observed. Most disturbing was his account of finding Martha Hensley in an upper room, surrounded by her sons, her body opened like a book on a table, while she remained conscious, her eyes tracking his movements as he fled. It was in October of 1891 that the first tangible evidence emerged, suggesting something truly sinister was occurring at the Hensley homestead. A surveyor working for the railroad company was mapping potential routes through the county when he discovered what he initially thought was an unmarked cemetery on the edge of the Hensley property. Closer inspection revealed a series of shallow depressions in the earth, each approximately 6 feet in length, arranged in concentric circles around a central point. The surveyor's report notes that the ground in these areas appeared recently disturbed and that a persistent odor of decay hung about the site. Most disturbing was his observation that the central point of the circles contained a crude altar-like structure constructed of limestone and timber, bearing stains of uncertain origin. The surveyor brought his findings to the attention of the county sheriff, who organized a small party to investigate. According to the official report, dated October 17, 1891, when the group arrived at the location, they found nothing unusual. No depressions, no altar, no signs of disturbance. The surveyor, whose reputation had been unblemished until this point, was discredited and subsequently left the county. His field journal, however, contained detailed sketches of what he claimed to have seen, including precise measurements and compass bearings. What is not mentioned in the official report, but appears in a private letter from one of the deputies present during the investigation, is that as the party approached the site, they observed 4 tall figures watching from the tree line, standing perfectly still for upwards of 20 minutes before melting back into the forest. The deputy also noted that despite finding no physical evidence of the reported depressions, the dogs brought to assist in the search refused to approach the area, whimpering and pulling at their leads as if in mortal terror. The winter of 1891-1892 was marked by unusual phenomena throughout Harlan County. These drawings are now preserved in the special collections of the University of Kentucky Archive, though they were not made public until 1958. Weather records indicate that the temperature remained consistently below freezing from late November through March, with snowfall well above average. Several residents reported seeing strange lights in the sky above the Hensley property, like the aurora borealis, but confined to that hollow and moving with purpose rather than the random dance of the northern lights. Church attendance reached record levels, with ministers noting a pervasive sense of dread among their congregations. What happened during those winter months at the Hensley homestead can only be pieced together from fragmentary accounts and subsequent investigations. The family made no appearances in town during this time, which was not unusual given the weather conditions. But by early spring, neighbors began to notice an unusual silence had fallen over the Hensley property. The smoke that typically rose from their chimney was absent, and no activity could be observed from a distance. A local trapper whose route took him near the Hensley property in late March reported that the snow in the vicinity had melted in an unusual pattern, a perfect circle approximately 100 yards in diameter surrounding the house, while the surrounding area remained blanketed in white. He also claimed to have found a series of tracks leading away from the house toward the deeper mountains. Not human tracks, nor those of any animal I've encountered in 40 years of trapping these hills. The trapper did not investigate further, citing an overwhelming sense of wrongness that drove him from the area. It was a mail carrier named Joseph Miller who finally approached the house in April of 1892. Finding the door ajar, Miller later told authorities he called out several times before entering. His testimony, recorded in shaky handwriting by the county clerk, describes the house as cold as a tomb despite the spring warmth outside, and pervaded by a stillness that seemed to swallow all sound. Miller claimed to have moved through the main floor, finding no signs of recent habitation, though the rooms were in perfect order, as if the family had simply stepped out moments before. What caused Miller to flee the property was his discovery in the kitchen. According to his statement, the large wooden table that dominated the room held 5 place settings, each with a plate containing what appeared to be a carefully arranged human ear. Miller immediately returned to town to alert the authorities. The sheriff's posse that returned to the property that same day found the kitchen exactly as Miller had described, except that the plates were empty. A thorough search of the house revealed no signs of violence or struggle, but several disturbing anomalies were noted. The walls of the main hallway were covered in a substance described as similar to molasses in consistency, but clear as glass and odorless. This substance appeared to be seeping from between the timber planks, yet when touched, left no residue on the fingers. In what appeared to be Martha Hensley's bedroom, they discovered a journal bound in what the report delicately refers to as material of organic origin. The contents of this journal were never made public, but a deputy present during the investigation later committed suicide, leaving behind a note that read only, "What I read cannot be unread. What was done cannot be undone." The most significant discovery, however, was made in the cellar of the house. Behind a false wall, investigators found a room approximately 15 feet square, its walls covered in elaborate writings and symbols. At the center of the room stood a chair bolted to the floor, with leather restraints attached to the arms and legs. The sheriff's report notes that the floor beneath the chair was stained dark, and a drainage channel had been cut into the stone, leading to a collection vessel. The report goes on to state that numerous surgical implements were arranged on a nearby table, all showing signs of regular use. A deputy's personal account, shared with his pastor but not included in official reports, adds that the symbols on the walls appeared to be moving slightly, as if breathing, and that the air in the room was thick with a scent like overripe fruit and copper. He also claimed that the collection vessel contained a substance, neither liquid nor solid, that seemed to respond to proximity by reaching upward, as water might to a charged object. No trace of the Hensley family was ever found. Despite an extensive search of the surrounding area, including the use of tracking dogs brought in from Lexington, no bodies were recovered, nor was there any indication of where they might have gone. The house stood empty for several years before being purchased by the coal company, which subsequently demolished it to make way for mining operations. Curiously, the company's records indicate that 3 separate demolition teams quit the job before it was finally completed, each citing equipment failures and unspecified concerns about the site. A local historian named Abigail Thornton, who interviewed several members of these demolition crews in the early 1900s, recorded their consistent accounts of strange phenomena during the dismantling of the house. Workers reported tools disappearing and reappearing in different locations, unexplained cold spots that persisted even in direct sunlight, and sounds like distant conversation that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Most disturbing were reports that the timber, when cut, oozed a clear fluid with the consistency of maple syrup but lacking any scent, identical to what had been observed by the sheriff's posse years earlier. The case might have faded into obscurity were it not for the discovery made in 1923 by geologists surveying the area. In a natural cave system approximately 2 miles from the former Hensley property, they discovered what one report described as evidence of habitation of the most disturbing nature. The caves contained remnants of furniture, clothing, and personal items that were later connected to the Hensley family. Most alarmingly, they also contained hundreds of glass jars, each meticulously labeled and dated, containing what appeared to be preserved human tissue. The initial geological survey had been commissioned to assess the area's potential for expanded mining operations. The head geologist, Dr. Lawrence Pritchard, filed a comprehensive report that was promptly classified by state authorities. However, Pritchard's field notes, which surfaced briefly in 1957 before being confiscated by federal agents, described finding a series of chambers deep within the cave system, some of which appeared to have been artificially expanded and reinforced. The deepest chamber, accessible only through a narrow passage that required crawling, opened into what Pritchard described as a laboratory that would not be out of place in a modern medical facility, albeit with a distinctly macabre character. According to these notes, the central feature of this chamber was a stone table with drainage channels, similar to those found in the Hensley cellar. Surrounding this table were shelves carved from the living rock, holding hundreds of glass jars arranged in what appeared to be a specific order. Each jar was labeled with a date, a sequence of symbols, and what Pritchard believed to be a classification system for human emotions. The jars contained substances of varying colors and consistencies, all preserved in a clear solution. A subsequent police investigation determined that the samples dated back to at least 1883, suggesting that whatever the Hensleys had been engaged in had been ongoing for nearly a decade before their disappearance. The jars were removed to the medical examiner's office in Louisville, but records indicate they were destroyed in a fire that consumed that building in 1931. Whether this fire was accidental remains a matter of speculation, particularly given that it originated in the secure storage area where the Hensley materials were kept, and occurred just days before a team of specialists from Johns Hopkins University was scheduled to examine them. Dr. Eliza Waterford, one of the few medical professionals who examined the samples before their destruction, left behind a private journal that came to light in the 1960s. In it, she describes the contents of the jars as defying conventional biological classification. According to her notes, the preserved tissues appeared to be hybrid structures, partially human in origin, but transformed through some unknown process into something that retained organic properties while exhibiting behaviors more commonly associated with conscious entities. Most disturbing was her observation that when exposed to certain stimuli, particularly strong emotionals, responses from those observing them, the specimens appeared to respond with movements that cannot be attributed to simple chemical reactions or mechanical processes. Perhaps the most unsettling development in the case came in 1952 when construction workers expanding a mine shaft near the former Hensley property broke through into a previously unknown cavern. According to sworn statements, they discovered a room carved from the living rock, its walls covered in the same strange symbols found in the Hensley cellar 60 years earlier. At the center of this room was a stone table, and on that table lay the perfectly preserved body of a woman believed to be Martha Hensley. The foreman who first entered the chamber, William Cochran, provided a detailed account to authorities. The room was cold, much colder than the surrounding cave system, though there was no obvious source of refrigeration. The woman lay as if sleeping, her skin pale but showing no signs of decomposition. Most strange was the fact that small objects in the room, a pencil, a book, a small glass vial, appeared to be suspended slightly above the surfaces on which they rested, as if gravity worked differently there. Medical authorities were baffled by the state of preservation, noting that the body showed no signs of decomposition despite having been dead for at least 60 years. Even more puzzling was the cause of death, or rather, the apparent absence of one. The examination report states that The subject exhibits no trauma, disease, or other pathology that would explain cessation of life functions. Indeed, were it not for the complete absence of vital signs and body temperature, one might conclude she was merely in a state of suspended animation. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that the woman's body had been subjected to hundreds of small, precise incisions, each one carefully sutured closed. When these sutures were removed during the autopsy, it was discovered that beneath each incision, a small object had been inserted into the flesh. These objects, described variously as seeds, crystals, or nodules of unknown composition, were collected for analysis but subsequently disappeared from the evidence room of the Kentucky State Police Barracks in Harlan. Dr. Victor Reese, who performed the autopsy, was found dead in his office 2 weeks later, an apparent suicide. However, his assistant, a young medical student named Thomas Jenkins, later claimed that Reese had been in excellent spirits the day before his death and had mentioned a breakthrough in understanding the nature of the objects removed from Martha Hensley's body. Jenkins was committed to a psychiatric facility shortly after making these claims, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His medical records, however, show no previous history of mental illness, and colleagues described him as the most level-headed student in the program. The body itself was scheduled for transfer to medical facilities in Cincinnati for further study, but during transport, the ambulance carrying it was involved in a single-vehicle accident on a remote stretch of a highway. By the time rescue workers reached the scene, the vehicle and its contents had been completely consumed by fire. The 2 attendants accompanying the body were never found, though a search party discovered one of their identification badges approximately half a mile from the accident site, along with footprints leading deeper into the forest. In the years following these events, several researchers attempted to piece together the full story of the Hensley family. A graduate student from Duke University, Alexandra Winters, began collecting oral histories from elderly residents of Harlan County in 1963. Her work uncovered several consistent themes, namely, that the Hensleys were believed to have been engaged in some form of experimentation related to human consciousness and its physical manifestations. One account, from a man who claimed his grandfather had done carpentry work for the family in the 1880s, suggested that Elijah Hensley had developed an obsession with what he called the architecture of the soul. According to this source, Hensley believed that human emotions left physical imprints on the body that could be harvested and preserved. The informant claimed that his grandfather had been asked to build special containment cabinets designed to Hensley's exacting specifications with unusual features such as lead lining and hermetic seals. Another elderly resident, who requested anonymity, told Winters that as a child in the 1890s, she had once encountered Abel Hensley in the woods near her family's farm. She described him as unnaturally tall and thin, with eyes that seemed to look through rather than at you. According to her account, Hensley had asked her a series of questions about what made her afraid and what made her happy before producing a small brass instrument like a doctor's stethoscope, but with a glass vial where the earpieces should be. When her father appeared calling her name, Hensley had quickly departed, but not before saying, "Your joy has a particularly vivid color. We will speak again when you're older." The woman claimed her family moved to Ohio shortly afterward, at her father's insistence. Winters' research was never completed. In May of 1964, she informed her faculty advisor that she had discovered a cache of letters written by Elijah Hensley to an unnamed correspondent, describing in detail his procedures and their results. 3 days later, her research materials were found scattered across her apartment, and Winters herself had vanished. The case remains open in the files of the Durham Police Department. A curious footnote to Winters' disappearance emerged in 1967 when a patient at a psychiatric hospital in Vermont claimed to have encountered her at a remote bus station in West Virginia. According to this account, Winters appeared disoriented and afraid, repeatedly stating that they found a way to distill it, to make it tangible. When asked what she meant, she allegedly replied, "Fear, grief, joy, the things we feel." They found a way to extract them, to preserve them, to use them, and they're still doing it. Before the witness could learn more, Winters reportedly boarded a bus bound for Kentucky. No further confirmed sightings of her have been reported. The most recent chapter in the Hensley saga came in 1968, when a logger working in the area of the former homestead discovered a metal box buried at the base of an old oak tree. Inside was a journal, its pages brittle with age, containing what appeared to be Elijah Hensley's own account of his work. The journal was turned over to authorities, who subsequently classified its contents. However, before this classification occurred, a court clerk claimed to have read portions of the document. Though sworn to secrecy, on his deathbed in 1979, he told his son that the journal described a process whereby human emotions could be distilled through carefully timed surgical procedures performed while the subject was conscious. These emotions, particularly those associated with fear, grief, and despair, were said to manifest as physical substances within the body that could be extracted and preserved. The clerk's son, who requested anonymity when sharing this account with a journalist in 1981, claimed his father had been particularly disturbed by passages describing the Hensley's ultimate goal. According to this second-hand account, the family believed that by collecting and combining these emotional essences in specific proportions, they could create a compound that would allow them to transcend the limitations of individual consciousness and achieve a state of collective being, unfettered by the constraints of separate physical forms. Most disturbing was his claim that the journal's final entry, dated January 17, 1892, read simply, "The final phase begins tonight. If successful, we shall transcend the limitations of individual consciousness and achieve what no humans before us have accomplished. If we fail, may God forgive what we have already done." The journalist who recorded this account, Martin Donovan, intended to include it in a book about Appalachian folklore. Before the book could be published, however, Donovan suffered a stroke that left him unable to communicate. His manuscript notes were subsequently lost in what the publishing house described as an unfortunate clerical error. The clerk's son refused all further requests for interviews and reportedly moved out of state shortly thereafter. In 1969, a speleologist named Dr. Rachel Harper led an expedition to map the cave system where the preserved specimens had been discovered decades earlier. Her team penetrated deeper into the network than any previous explorers, eventually discovering a chamber that did not appear on any earlier surveys. Harper's field journal describes this chamber as perfectly spherical, approximately 30 feet in diameter, with a floor as smooth as polished marble. Most remarkable was her observation that the chamber appeared to defy certain physical laws. Objects placed on the floor would slowly migrate toward the center, as if drawn by a subtle gravitational force. At the center of the chamber, Harper's team discovered a circular depression containing a substance she described as neither solid nor liquid, with a consistency similar to mercury but clear as glass. When a member of the team attempted to collect a sample, the substance reportedly rose up in a column, maintaining this shape for several seconds before collapsing back into the depression. Shortly afterward, all members of the expedition experienced what Harper termed an overwhelming emotional response that appeared to cycle through various states: fear, grief, euphoria, before settling into a profound sense of disassociation. The team retreated, but not before Harper observed that the walls of the chamber appeared to be inscribed with symbols identical to those found in the Hensley cellar. Harper's expedition notes were submitted to the Geological Department at the University of Tennessee, but were never published. When she attempted to organize a follow-up expedition, she was informed that the cave system had been designated a restricted area due to structural instability concerns. Harper herself suffered from increasingly severe psychological symptoms in the months following the expedition, eventually resigning her position and withdrawing from professional life entirely. In a rare interview granted in 1975, she stated only that, "There are things in this world that we are not equipped to understand, and the Hensley discovery is one of them." What exactly happened to the Hensley family remains one of Appalachia's darkest mysteries. Some believe they perished in their own experiments, while others suggest they succeeded in whatever terrible transformation they sought. Local folklore holds that, on particularly cold winter nights, lights can still be seen moving through the trees where their house once stood, and those who have ventured too close have reported hearing whispers that seem to emanate from the earth itself. A local tradition, documented by folklorist Henry Collins in the 1950s, but dating back much earlier, holds that the Hensleys didn't disappear, but rather changed into something else. According to this tradition, they achieved their goal of transcending individual consciousness, merging into a single entity that could no longer maintain human form. Collins recorded several accounts from elderly residents who claimed that in the years following the Hensleys' disappearance, hikers and hunters occasionally encountered something in the deep woods near their former property. Not quite a person, not quite an animal, but something that knew your name and could speak with multiple voices at once. The land where the Hensley property once stood is now owned by a subsidiary of a multinational mining corporation. Attempts to conduct archaeological investigations of the site have been consistently blocked by the company, citing safety concerns due to unstable mine workings beneath the surface. In 1967, a team from the University of Kentucky was granted brief access to the area, but found that the topography had been so altered by mining activities that no trace of the original homestead could be identified. However, the team's report notes one unusual finding. At the approximate location where the house had stood, their instruments detected a persistent temperature anomaly, with the ground registering approximately 15 degrees cooler than the surrounding area, regardless of ambient conditions. This finding was dismissed as an equipment malfunction at the time, but similar anomalies have been reported by mining engineers working in the vicinity in subsequent decades. The records pertaining to the case are scattered across various archives and collections, many of them restricted or conveniently misplaced over the years. The most comprehensive file, compiled by Kentucky State Police investigator James Tharp in the 1950s, was reportedly stored in the Harlan County Courthouse until a flood in 1963 damaged much of the building's basement archives. When the material was finally assessed, Tharp's file was among the items listed as unsalvageable. Tharp himself maintained personal copies of his research, which his daughter claimed to have found after his death in 1971. According to family members, before these documents could be examined, a government representative arrived at the Tharp home and confiscated all materials relating to the Hensley case, citing national security concerns. No record of this confiscation exists in any official capacity. For those few researchers who have managed to piece together fragments of the story, a disturbing pattern emerges, not just of the horrors perpetrated by the Hensley family, but of the systematic erasure of those events from public record. This pattern has led some to speculate that whatever the Hensleys discovered was deemed too dangerous for public knowledge, perhaps even appropriated for purposes unknown. A retired federal agent, speaking anonymously to a researcher in 1982, claimed that a classified program had been initiated in the 1950s to locate and secure all records relating to the Hensley case. The agent, who claimed to have participated in this program, stated that the government had become interested in the Hensleys' work after receiving reports that they had developed methods for the physical extraction and preservation of emotional states. According to this source, similar research was being conducted by both American and Soviet scientists during the Cold War, though with considerably less success than the Hensleys had apparently achieved decades earlier. The last known person to actively investigate the case was a journalist named Michael Crandall, who spent 6 months in Harlan County in 1968 researching a book on the subject. His manuscript, tentatively titled The Harvesters of Harlan, was nearly complete when he abruptly abandoned the project and left the area. When contacted years later by another researcher, Crandall refused to discuss his work, saying only that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. A colleague who had worked with Crandall during his investigation later revealed that in the final weeks of his research, Crandall had become increasingly paranoid, claiming to be followed by men in black suits and receiving anonymous phone calls where the caller said nothing but heavy breathing, like multiple people breathing in unison. Most disturbing was the colleague's claim that Crandall had discovered evidence suggesting the Hensley family had not been working in isolation, but rather as part of a wider network with similar interests, a network that potentially remained active. In perhaps the strangest epilogue to this story, in 1969, a patient was admitted to the psychiatric ward of a hospital in Knoxville, Tennessee, claiming to be Elijah Hensley. The man, estimated to be in his 60s, which would have made him far too young to be the actual Elijah, demonstrated knowledge of details about the case that investigators believed had never been made public. After 3 weeks of evaluation, during which several specialists interviewed him, the man was transferred to a federal facility for further assessment. No record of his arrival at this facility exists, and his current whereabouts remain unknown. Dr. Susan Watkins, one of the psychiatrists who evaluated this patient, kept detailed notes of their sessions, which she shared with a colleague shortly before her sudden death in a house fire in 1973. According to these notes, the man claiming to be Hensley spoke lucidly and at length about the family's work, describing it as the first successful attempt to bridge the gap between metaphysical experience and physical reality. He claimed that emotions were not merely neurochemical responses, but actual physical substances that could be extracted and preserved outside the body. Most chillingly, he stated that the ultimate goal had been to create a collective consciousness that would transcend the limitations of individual identity, and that they had succeeded. When asked to explain how he could be Elijah Hensley, who would have been well over 100 years old, the man reportedly smiled and said, "Time moves differently for us now. What you perceive as decades, we experience as moments. We are many, and we are one, and we move between vessels as needed." Watkins noted that throughout this statement, the man's voice seemed to modulate between different timbres, as if multiple voices were speaking in perfect unison through a single throat. Today, the story of the Hensley family exists primarily as a whispered warning among the oldest families of Harlan County. Parents caution children not to venture too deep into certain hollows, and the name Hensley is conspicuously absent from local genealogical records, despite the family's documented presence in the area for over a decade. A sociological study conducted by the University of Kentucky in the 1990s noted that residents of the area surrounding the former Hensley property reported higher incidences of vivid nightmares, sleep disturbances, and what the researchers termed emotional dysregulation, extreme mood swings that seemed to occur without obvious cause. The study's authors attributed these findings to socioeconomic factors and the psychological impacts of the region's economic decline following the contraction of the coal industry. However, they noted one curious anomaly. These symptoms appeared to diminish with distance from the former Hensley property, creating a pattern that one researcher described as concentric rings of influence, with the epicenter located precisely where the homestead once stood. The few physical traces that remain are treated with superstitious caution. In the Special Collections Room of the University of Kentucky Library, the surveyor's drawings of the circular depressions are kept in a locked cabinet, accessible only with special permission. A librarian who worked in this department for over 30 years reported that on 3 separate occasions, researchers who examined these materials subsequently requested that their contact information be removed from university records, citing privacy concerns, but offering no further explanation. The cave system where the preserved specimens were discovered has been sealed by the mining company ostensibly due to concerns about structural integrity. However, a former security guard employed by the company in the 1970s claimed in a local newspaper interview that the real reason for the sealing was an incident in 1972, when 3 mining engineers entered the cave system to assess its stability and only 1 returned. The survivor, according to this account, was found wandering along the road 2 days after the expedition, suffering from extreme dehydration and exposure. When questioned about his colleagues, he reportedly stated that they had become part of it, though he could not or would not elaborate on what it referred to. In 1983, a documentary filmmaker named Carolyn Reeves attempted to produce a feature on the Hensley case for a cable television network. After several months of research and filming, the project was abruptly canceled, with the network citing creative differences. Reeves, however, claimed in a subsequent interview with an independent film journal that the real reason was pressure from unnamed government agencies who had warned the network about potential regulatory issues if the documentary aired. Most of Reeves' footage and research materials were returned to her, but she reported that certain key elements were missing. Specifically, interviews with 2 elderly residents who claimed to have had direct contact with the Hensley family, and footage taken inside a section of the cave system that her team had managed to access through an unmarked entrance. Reeves described this missing footage as showing unusual acoustic properties in a particular chamber, where sounds appeared to linger and transform as if the space itself were somehow processing and altering them. A geological survey conducted in 1988 using ground-penetrating radar detected anomalies beneath the former Hensley property that the supervising scientist described as inconsistent with natural formations. The report noted that at depths of 30 to 50 feet, there appeared to be a network of chambers and tunnels that do not correspond to any known cave systems in the region. A proposed excavation to investigate these findings was denied permits by both state and federal authorities, citing potential impacts on watershed quality and endangered bat populations, justifications that local environmental groups described as puzzling, given the extensive mining operations permitted in adjacent areas. What the Hensley family sought, and whether they found it, may never be known with certainty. But their legacy persists in the collective memory of the region, a dark chapter in the history of Appalachia that resists both investigation and resolution. The fragments that remain, scattered records, contradictory testimonies, physical anomalies that defy conventional explanation, suggest a truth more disturbing than any single narrative could encompass. Those who have studied the case most closely suggest that perhaps the most merciful outcome would be for the truth to remain buried in those ancient hills. As one elderly resident told Alexandra Winters before her disappearance, "Some knowledge ain't meant for bearing. What them Hensleys was after, that's the kind of truth that burns through a mind like acid through paper." In 2002, a retired psychologist named Dr. Robert Maxwell published a paper in an obscure academic journal suggesting that the Hensley case represented a rare instance of collective psychic infection, a phenomenon in which powerful emotional states can, under certain conditions, create persistent alterations in the physical environment. Maxwell proposed that the extreme isolation of the Hensley property, combined with the family's apparent experiments with emotional states, had created a psychically charged locale where the boundary between mental and physical reality had become permanently blurred. Maxwell's paper received little attention from mainstream academia, but it attracted interest from researchers in more esoteric fields. One such researcher, Her findings, published in the Journal of Anomalistic Environmental Studies, indicated that the area surrounding the former Hensley property exhibited electromagnetic signatures inconsistent with typical geological formations, suggesting the presence of an energy source that does not conform to known physical principles. Vasquez's research team also reported unusual subjective experiences while working at the site, predominantly emotional fluctuations that seemed to occur simultaneously among all members, regardless of their proximity to one another. Elena Vasquez conducted a series of measurements at the site in 2005, using equipment designed to detect subtle electromagnetic variations. It was as if we were all suddenly connected to the same emotional current, Vasquez wrote. A wave of profound sadness would sweep through the entire team at once, followed by inexplicable euphoria, then dread, all with no apparent external trigger. After 3 days of these experiences, the team terminated the research project, with several members reporting persistent psychological effects for months afterward. In 2007, a local historical society attempted to place a small marker near the site of the former Hensley homestead, acknowledging it as a location of historical significance without detailing the nature of the events that had occurred there. Within a week of its installation, the marker was found uprooted and broken, with no evidence of how the damage had occurred. A second marker, installed with a concrete base, disappeared entirely just days after its placement. No further attempts have been made to mark the site. The mountains keep their secrets well. In the hollows and caves of Harlan County, echoes of the past persist, but they speak in whispers that few can interpret, and fewer still would wish to hear. The case of the Hensley family stands as a grim reminder that the darkest horrors often wear a human face, and that the quest for forbidden knowledge can lead to transformations from which there is no return. As for the physical location where these events transpired, nature has reclaimed much of what man abandoned. The hollow where the Hensley house once stood is now overgrown with the dense vegetation characteristic of the region. Local hunters and hikers give the area a wide berth, reporting an unusual silence there, an absence of the wildlife sounds that typically fill the Appalachian forests. Some claim that devices with magnetic components, compasses, certain watches, modern cell phones, malfunction in proximity to the site, though these reports have never been systematically verified. A park ranger who patrolled the broader area from 1995 to 2012 noted in his official logs that despite the apparent absence of animal life, the vegetation in the hollow thrived to an unusual degree. The trees grow faster, the flowers bloom longer, the foliage remains greener even in drought, he wrote. It's as if the plant life is feeding on something other than the usual nutrients. The ranger also documented a recurring phenomenon wherein fog would form in the hollow on clear days, appearing to rise from the ground itself rather than settling from above, and maintaining a perfect circular boundary that coincided roughly with the property lines of the former Hensley land. In the county records office, a small notation appears in the current land survey maps. A section approximately 1 mile square surrounding the former Hensley property is marked simply, "Restricted Area, no access without authorization." When questioned about this designation, county officials refer inquiries to the mining company, which in turn cites environmental remediation concerns with no further elaboration. A former employee of the company's legal department, speaking on condition of anonymity, claimed that the designation dates back to a confidential agreement reached between the corporation and federal authorities in the 1960s. According to this source, the agreement stipulates that the area remains under corporate ownership but is subject to periodic inspections by unnamed government agencies. The employee claimed to have seen documents referring to these inspections as containment assessments, though the nature of what was being contained was never specified. In 2015, a graduate student in folkloristics recorded an interview with an elderly woman who had lived her entire life in Harlan County. The woman, then in her 90s, claimed that her grandmother had been a friend of Martha Hensley before the family's isolation became complete. According to this third-hand account, Martha had confided to the grandmother that Elijah had become obsessed with the idea that human emotions left physical traces in the body, like rings in a tree, showing what we felt and when we felt it. The grandmother had reportedly visited the Hensley home for the last time in the summer of 1884, when she found Martha much altered, and speaking of her husband's work, with a mixture of fear and pride. Martha allegedly showed the grandmother a small glass vial containing a substance like mercury, but warm to the touch, which she claimed was distilled grief taken from a widow who lost her husband in the mine collapse. When the grandmother asked how such a thing was possible, Martha replied only that Elijah found a way to open the places where feelings live in the flesh and to draw them out while they're still fresh. Perhaps the final word on the Hensley family comes from an unexpected source, a letter discovered in 1967 among the personal effects of Sheriff Leland Parker, who led the initial investigation of the abandoned homestead in 1892. Written but apparently never sent, the letter was addressed to the governor of Kentucky and contains a passage that seems to encapsulate the enduring mystery. What we found in that hollow defies explanation in terms familiar to God-fearing men. I have served as an officer of the law in this county for 23 years and witnessed my share of cruelty and depravity. But what the Hensley family sought to accomplish goes beyond mere criminality or madness. They aim to violate boundaries set by our Creator, to harvest something sacred from human suffering and use it for purposes I dare not commit to paper. That they disappeared rather than face justice is both a relief and a terrible burden, for it leaves open the possibility that somewhere, somehow, their work continues in darkness. The letter ends with a recommendation that the Hensley property be destroyed completely and the land never again used for human habitation. This recommendation, like so much else connected to this case, appears to have been ignored or deliberately set aside by those in positions of authority. A curious footnote to Parker's letter emerged in 2011, when a historian researching the sheriff's career discovered a series of journal entries written in the months following the Hensley investigation. These entries document Parker's growing conviction that he was being followed by figures at the edge of vision, and his increasing difficulty in distinguishing between waking and dreaming states. The final entry, dated September 18, 1892, reads, "I can no longer trust my own perceptions. The line between what is and what I fear has blurred beyond recognition. I find myself speaking words that are not my own, feeling emotions that seem to come from elsewhere. What if they succeeded? What if what they made has found a new vessel? God forgive me, but I fear I may have brought something back with me from that hollow." Parker resigned his position shortly after this entry and reportedly left Harlan County, though no record of his subsequent whereabouts has been discovered. His successor as sheriff made no mention of the Hensley case in any official capacity, and within a year it appears to have been effectively erased from local governance records, surviving only in private correspondence and personal accounts. In 2018, a team of environmental scientists conducting a broader study of soil composition in the Appalachian region included samples from the vicinity of the former Hensley property. Their findings, published in the Journal of Environmental Chemistry, noted anomalous concentrations of certain organic compounds in these samples, compounds typically associated with human biological processes, but present in quantities that the researchers described as difficult to reconcile with known natural processes. The paper speculated that these anomalies might be the result of historical industrial contamination, though it acknowledged that no record of such activity existed for the specific location. What might be most telling about the Hensley case is not what we know, but what we don't, the systematic gaps in the record, the convenient disappearances of evidence, the abrupt terminations of investigations that appear to have come too close to some hidden truth. These negative spaces form a pattern of their own, suggesting a story that has been deliberately obscured rather than simply forgotten. And so the story remains, fragmented, obscured, but persistent in the collective memory of a region known for its long remembrance. In Harlan County, where the past is never truly past, the name Hensley serves as a warning of how quickly human curiosity can descend into unfathomable darkness. The mountains stand silent witness to what occurred there, their ancient stones the only reliable repository of a truth too terrible for human records to preserve intact. For those who seek to understand what really happened in that remote hollow in the winter of 1892, perhaps the wisest counsel comes from the final entry in Alexandra Winter's research journal, written the day before her disappearance. I now understand why so many who have investigated this case have abandoned their efforts. There is a weight to this knowledge, a terrible gravity that pulls the mind toward places it was never meant to go. I have decided to leave my research unfinished, for completion would require a journey from which I sense there can be no return. The Appalachian Mountains are old beyond reckoning, their hollows and caves holding secrets that date back to the very formation of the continent. What the Hensley family awoke in those ancient hills, or what awoke in them, remains a mystery wrapped in deliberate obscurity, protected by time and the natural human resistance to confronting true darkness. In the end, the most terrifying aspect of the Hensley story may be not what they discovered, but what their discovery implies about the nature of human consciousness itself. That our most private experiences, our emotions and sensations, might have a physical reality beyond our understanding, that they might be extracted, preserved, studied, that they might in some sense exist independently of the minds that generated them, and that knowledge, once gained, might change the knower in ways that transcend the boundaries we assume to be fixed and immutable, and perhaps that is as it should be. For some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again, and what waits beyond them is sometimes best left undisturbed in the shadowed hollows of both land and memory.